Chapter 6, A Kind-Hearted Woman. I got a kind-hearted woman. She studies evil all the time. You use wells to kill me as to have it on your mind. Robert Johnson. Donna Gordon Prelude, Empress of Bitchery, mirror of my own obsession with sex, exploiter of my genius for catastrophe. A Botticelli face, gray-green eyes a little askew, the sweet small red mouth made for lies and lovemaking. She was a year older and a class above me when I met her. Making the rounds of the dope-smoking, coked-out musicians in the night scene, she'd broken some hearts and fucked up some heads, and she was clearly getting off on it. Homecoming 1976, the Tri-Delt House. Board, stone, jack shock, slide guitar player for the Terraplanes, looking for Susie Cream Cheese among the glassy-eyed college girls in tight dresses who used each other like bird dogs to point out who they would roll and tumble that night. Then I saw her. Two thin braids on either side of her face, long honey blonde hair, skin the same color on arms and legs that looked too good to be real, smiling wide, mouth open a little. The band had gone on break and I was playing Blind Willie Johnson. Dark was the night, cold was the ground, the day my Savior died. A prophecy, if I had known it then, of my marriage. The song had nothing to do with why she was looking at me. Her eyes, the tilt of her body, her smile, all telegraphing that she was there, that I could have her, that she'd make sure I liked what I came for. I knew she slept with Rucker with the casual promiscuity the cool affected in the 70s. But that fact didn't have the cock-blocking effect that it should have. No, I didn't flinch that night when she told me that she'd gotten to Rucker to get to me. I felt flattered. After I met her father, I felt fated. He was a land developer from Mobile, and I looked like a younger version of the daddy that had spoiled her rotten. Before I met Donna, I cloaked sex in an English major's idealism. For God's sake, hold your tongue and let me love, and all that. Any illusion I had that Donna was a kindred spirit went out the window soon enough. She had it bad for me, all right, but I had it even worse for her. The Jack Shock I was back then really did love the girl. Shallow Jack, sucker for a beautiful face, a woman's body, a mind alive with games. She made it her business to know me through and through, and she came after me with a singleness of purpose that no one else had ever shown. Yes, I was infatuated, obsessed, call it what you want to. And that first night when she took me to her room, I remember thinking as she touched her tongue to the head of my cock and smiled at me that I'd have probably set myself on fire if she'd asked me to. I don't doubt that Donna wasn't lying when she said she loved me as much as she had loved anyone. As for bonehead me, I couldn't even imagine life without her. But then I didn't know much back then, least of all about Jack Shock. The night before graduation, she asked me if I wanted to make an honest woman out of her. We were standing in a rose garden beside a serpentine wall on the East Range. I told her I didn't want her honest, I wanted her bad. A year later, we were married in one of those enormous southern weddings that begin a week before the vows and end with a cruise to an island in the Caribbean. From the beginning, our love fed on jealousy, fights, parties, stormy partings. But Donna knew she had my undivided attention, and at first that was enough. When I was accepted into graduate school at Chapel Hill, the donkey work of the doctoral program replaced the melodrama of adrenaline rushes. Once I started my dissertation, she started staying out late. I didn't blame her. She was nobody's idea of Penelope. Then I caught her in bed with my Faulkner professor. When I say caught, what I mean is I was the prey, not him. It was my comeuppance. We reconciled, but it was never the same for me after that. One thing troubled me more and more as time went on. In all the years I lived with her, I never saw Donna commit a single act of disinterested kindness. Once we'd moved back to Charlottesville, and I was thoroughly enmeshed in the routine of teaching and work on the book, Donna began selling real estate to supplement Daddy Prelude's allowance, a sum already several $1,000s more than my salary. Before long, she found her way into the Horsey set, riding to hounds at Farmington and cruising the nights in her pink convertible Beamer, another gift from Mobile. I had ceased to care whether she was cheating on me or not. All that remained between us towards the end was sex. You know how it goes. The more I hated her, the more I wanted her. Night by night, we sweated wordlessly in each other's arms, except for the little cries Donna gave as the transport stripped her about 10 minutes into coitus. You could have set your clock by them. God knows how long our joke of a marriage would have lasted if I hadn't walked in on her fucking one of the horsey clients on the kitchen butcher block. I didn't know I had it in me, but I kicked him in his naked balls and cut off his ponytail with the bread knife buried in a cutting board by the sink. I dragged him by the ears to the living room and sent him out by the window. Then I helped Donna, also Starkers, find the door and urged her Beamer on its way with some sharp heel kicks, which I used to recontour the fenders. I never let her in the house again. The next day I rented the biggest U-Haul I could find and moved everything except my clothes and books into it. It sat there for 11 days until I found the apartment where she and Horsey Boy were staying. I drove the truck over to her new address, parked it, taped the truck key to her windshield, and left it there blocking the Beamer, now restored to its epicene splendor. This melodramatic gesture cost me $470 in U-Haul fees, but by then I was done with her. I'd had my fill of Death Wish Revisited. There was one false step. I nailed her on her office desk after we talked, argued over the settlement. That was the last tango in Seaville for Donna and me. We went back to fighting over the property. The sticking point was the cabin I'd built over 2 summers in Nelson County. I wouldn't agree to let her have it. Meanwhile, her ponytailless lover, a rich cokehead named Dabney Wimbish, had run out on his wife and 2 kids. Later, after his life was good and wrecked, Donna kicked him out and rented a place a block down the street from our old house. There she made a stab at the role of the aggrieved but forgiving spouse. To judge by the changing stream of cars that soon appeared at all hours of the night and morning, she tired of the part quickly. She had no trouble recruiting stand-ins. She still had her looks, all in the bones and skin. She looked better, if anything, than when I'd married her, and she made sure I knew it. Dropping by with a new lover in tow with an offer to share some Remy or cocaine. Declined, without thanks. Calling me from her bed while she carried on a nuts and bolts conversation with her lover of the moment on sexual technique. Subtlety was not Donna's long suit. The final ploy in her strategy to bring me to my knees was the pursuit and capture of my chief rival for tenure and best friend. In the best postmodern way, Bill Smalls, a Shakespeare scholar, yoked Foucault to the bard in a series of articles later published as a book. I can still remember some of the chapter titles because I read and edited the manuscript. Hamlet on the battlements, linguistics as endgame, the black man's burden, the phenomenology of enslavement in Othello, Apocalypse Now, Coriolanus, a structuralist reading, Lear as Lacan, the syntax of insanity. Bill's work was hardly cutting edge. He was shrewd enough to see that the university didn't really want to be identified as avant-garde. In spite of an acute case of Harvarditis, Bill's symptoms being name-dropping and an unconvincing broad A. I liked Smalls because he loved books. He could quote whole passages of the plays. That, and a willingness to talk unguardedly about ideas, was what kept us friends in a department where colleagues saw colleagues as Machiavellis and Mata Harris, ready to steal their big ideas at every cocktail throng. Smalls' wife, Tiny Betsy with her huge blue eyes, and Nevin Casey, boy and girl twins, were the family I told myself I wished I had. Tall, stick-thin with a boy's skin and dark hair, looking with his thin-rimmed spectacles a little like Dennis the Menace's dad, Bill was a friend who actually followed through on his offers to help, and who treated me with an affection that belied our status as rivals for the tenure-track job that we believed awaited one of us at the end of 8 years of ill-paid, hard-slogging anxiety. Actually, Both of us took for granted that no real rivalry existed, since the department had hired me only in response to a demand from Richmond for a folklorist with an African-American concentration. I was the only plausible candidate on the stage that year. No one seriously entertained the notion that I'd actually be given any kind of permanent position. For one thing, I wasn't African-American. For another, almost nobody in the department had even heard of Robert Johnson. Certainly, they didn't consider my interest in him evidence of serious scholarship. I don't like to think it now, and I never consciously processed it then. But maybe the reason that Bill stayed my friend through my drinking and laconic despair during those years was that he took for granted what everyone else did, that I'd go up or down in flames on scaffold day, a wisp in the coral sea of that good oblivion to which the department commended the souls of those graduate students and assistant professors who fell short of its standards. I'm sure that when my book came out a couple of years before Doomsday, as we privately referred to our rendezvous at some disputed barricade within the tenure community, Bill's happiness at it and the reviews it got was sincere enough. Some generous praise by a soon-to-die agrarian of the Faulkner chapters a couple months later sowed a seed of doubt amongst the colleagues about whether they actually had my number. Could Jack Schock be a comer? A distinguished visitor from Yale who requested my company for lunch, a second invitation to give a lecture, this time in New Haven, on Robert Johnson, which I brilliantly declined, mostly because I was too hungover to plan the trip. All these things worked like Ahab's subterranean miner to erode the department's certainty that I was a loser, plain and simple. I never got wind of any of the undercurrents, locked in my bourbon-bemused solipsism of work and drink, but Bill Smalls, more sensitive to the winds of change, probably did. A subtle estrangement grew between us, and into that estrangement walked Donna, with all the subtlety of a train wreck. Donna, by transferring her attentions to Bill, derailed him. A man who would leave his adorable wife and kids for a siren like Donna, could such a man be serious? Serious or not serious were departmental code words for worth keeping and expendable. Pretty soon, my getting rid of Donna started to look like ruthlessness, a cardinal virtue in departmental eyes. Looking back, I guess I owe what success I've scored in academic life to Donna and to Robert Johnson. Because if she hadn't fucked Mr. Ponytail in our kitchen, I probably would have clung to her like a rotten life preserver in a sea of marital battery acid. Though objectivity should have told me that losing her was like winning the lottery, Donna, so I told myself, was all I had, and without her, life had ended for good and all. That last sentence, pathetic and melodramatic though it was, understates how I felt. My debt to Robert Johnson was not paid by the book I wrote on him. I had long loved the descending phrase, the flattened third of the pentatonic scale. When I first picked up a guitar, it was to bend a note. When I began to get good enough, I played the old country blues, mixing meters according to the feeling the music gave me. I learned my licks from old records by the masters, from Lightnin' Hopkins with his clean level Texas boogie and startling solos, from Big Bill Brunzi, who could play better than the best in about any style he wanted, New Orleans, Delta, Texas, or Chicago, from Leadbelly with his sweet high tenor and the interlocking of the bass line of his old Stella 12-string with his heel taps, from Blind Willie McTell, another 12-string man, with his thin, plaintive wail and trembling rich vibrato, from Tampa Red, whose creamy slide always hit the note dead in the middle, from Blind Lemon, the father of them all, inimitable, with a way of making his guitar sound like an old piano, except that he could play it faster than any pianist, the notes falling in cascades like leaves driven before the wind. From Sunhouse, with his stark, jangling slide and window-shaking baritone. From Scrapper Blackwell, with his tremolo national, hell on bends and stays. From Scrapper's main man, Leroy Carr, whose songs I loved, full of irony and self-deprecation and despair. From Champion Jack, whose New Orleans piano blended diminished chords and stride. And most of all, from the haunted voice of Robert Johnson. I remember the first time I heard that voice. I was at a party, and I had just taken a hit of reefer. The song was Kind-Hearted Woman. Ain't but the one thing made Mr. Johnson drink. Whenever that see you, baby, I begin to think, ooh, baby, my life won't be the same. The counterpoint of voice and guitar, both distorting sound, the voice like a record slowing down, and the triplet A chord on the 7th fret. And then soaring above it came that eerie falsetto, ooh, baby, my life won't be the same. The sound rising above the forlorn desire of the words themselves. Years later, when someone found the photographs, I was drawn to the one in which Robert Johnson sits with a big Gibson Kalamazoo in his lap, a lit cigarette in his mouth, the face asymmetrical, one eye bulging, the other in a squint, the fingers preternaturally long and simian, the hair cut close to the head, and the left ear bent forward, a little like the handle of a sugar bowl. A man who looks more than a little drunk and who wears his guitar like an undershirt. Why did I identify with a black man whose world I could only know in books and records? Maybe it was the car wreck that orphaned me as completely as if my father had died in it too, or the sick in me that attracted me to a woman like Donna Gordon Prelude. And there was a night when I believed I met the demon himself. Driving drunk and stoned on a country road, I saw on the road in front of me a man, palm uplifted, grinning. With a squeal of brakes, my car spun over the bank into space, landing in the soft mud of a newly plowed field. In the silence that followed, Robert Johnson's voice screamed through the car speaker. Me and the devil went walking side by side. Then the man walked to the bank, looked down at me. His face was black, scarred, the left eye almost closed in a squint. He was smoking a cigarette, clenched between gold-capped front teeth. You and the devil? White boy, you done seen the devil tonight. He laughed, and when he walked away, his heel taps echoed long in the still night, keeping syncopated time to the demon's song. Maybe I'd have been the Jack Shock I am no matter what. Maybe, as the wizards of the Science Palace say, I am just an outcome of random chemicals acting on genotypes, fated by genes to be thus, and tempered here and there by vents in the continuum of the wide Sargasso Sea. Pardon me if I prefer the demon theory. Throw into the mix the cannibal heart of Jack Shock that devoured what it loved. It was that heart that scared me now. That somehow by loving Sam, I would devour her too, like the Robert Johnson who sang, I mistreated my baby, and I don't know the reason why. I lay in bed that night next to Sam, thinking about the raveled threads of my life, trying to discern the pattern in the carpet, except I couldn't picture the carpet, let alone the pattern, just the ravelings like raw wool, clumped and scattered. I would say a word aloud, say love and listen to the sound of it disappear and the rhythm of her breathing. As much good as I felt for her, there was still the fear that it would leave me, like those heel taps, down a moonlit country lane. I decided that I would lose her forever if she waked and saw me watching over her like that, like hell's own doorman, opening wide the gates of abandon all hope. But she slept on. I went upstairs to my own room and fell asleep. Around dawn, I got up. I left a note on Sam's nightstand. I love you, it said. Be back for you soon if all goes well, Jack. I packed my bag in silence. I came down and stood at the threshold of that room, which to me at that moment contained the sum of all the goodness and beauty that I had ever known and ever would know. And I turned and walked out of the house and got into the Continental, and beneath the oyster-colored skies of the city morning, headed south toward Charlottesville.